1.9 billion euros. That's the number auditors went looking for in the summer of 2020. It was supposed to be sitting in 2 banks in the Philippines, cash the company had earned and parked safely offshore. So the auditors finally called the banks directly. And the bank said, there is no account. One of them said the document proving it was a forgery. The country's central bank said the money had never entered the Philippines at all. Not moved. Never there. This was not some back alley operation. This was Wirecard, a German technology champion, in the DAX, the index of Germany's 30 biggest companies. At its peak it was worth more than 24 billion euros, more than Deutsche Bank. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. For 16 months before it collapsed, journalists had been laying out the evidence in public. And Germany's own financial regulator responded, not by investigating the company, but by banning people from betting against it and reporting the journalists to the police. This is the story of how the watchdogs guarded the fraud. Start with how good it looked. Wirecard was founded in Munich in 1999, processing online payments, the invisible plumbing between a website's checkout button and your bank. Its early customers were heavily gambling and adult sites, the business's other processors wouldn't touch. Not a detail it advertised later. In 2002, a man named Markus Braun took over as CEO, an Austrian consultant who always wore a black turtleneck, styled himself a visionary, and put a large chunk of his own wealth into the company's stock. Under him, Wirecard did something clever. In 2006 it bought a banking license. Now it was both the company processing the payment and the bank issuing the card, a two-sided machine. To investors, that sounded like a fintech that had cracked the code. And the numbers it reported were spectacular. Revenue growing every year. Expansion across Asia. By 2018, the story reached its peak moment. In September, Wirecard was promoted into the DAX, Germany's blue-chip index, and the company it knocked out to get there was Commerzbank, a 148-year-old pillar of German banking. Sit with that image. A payment startup displacing one of the country's oldest banks from the national index. Wirecard was now, on paper, worth more than Deutsche Bank. German politicians called it a national tech success, proof Europe could grow its own Silicon Valley. But the engine of all that growth was a slice of the business called third-party acquiring. The claim was this: in countries where Wirecard didn't have its own license, it used local partner firms to process payments and took a cut. That cut was said to be enormous. By some measures it was most of the company's profit. And the cash those partners generated? It sat in escrow accounts, held by a trustee, far away. Money you were told was there. Held somewhere you couldn't check. Remember that. Not everyone bought the story. Starting in 2015, a Financial Times journalist named Dan McCrum began publishing a series digging into Wirecard's accounts, questions about acquisitions, about holes that didn't add up. Wirecard called it lies. Then, in January 2019, McCrum published the story that should have ended it. Working from internal documents out of Wirecard's Singapore office, the foot alleged that executives had been forging and backdating contracts to inflate revenue, booking sales that weren't real. Singapore's police began looking into it. Now watch what Wirecard did. It didn't open its books. It went on the attack. It sued the Financial Times. It claimed the whole thing was a conspiracy, that the reporters were working hand in glove with short sellers, investors betting the stock would fall, to manipulate the price. And this is the moment the story turns from a corporate fraud into something worse, because the German regulator agreed with the fraudster. BaFin, Germany's financial watchdog, did two extraordinary things. First, in February 2019, it banned short selling of Wirecard shares entirely, making it illegal to bet against the company. It was the first time in BaFin's history it had ever done that for a single company. It was, in effect, protecting the stock. And second, BaFin referred the journalists to prosecutors Dan McCrum and his colleague for suspected market manipulation. Read that again. Handed detailed evidence of a possible multi-billion-euro fraud, the regulator investigated the people who found it. That criminal probe into the reporters wasn't dropped until September 2020, 3 months after Wirecard had already collapsed. For 16 months, the official position of the German state was that the problem was the messenger. By late 2019, the pressure was too much to wave away, so Wirecard's own board tried to end the speculation. It hired KPMG, a second major accounting firm, to do a special independent audit and prove the doubters wrong. It did the opposite. KPMG's report, delivered in April 2020, said that for the third-party business, the crown jewel, the source of roughly half the reported revenue, it could not verify that the revenue was real. It couldn't confirm the customer relationships existed. It couldn't confirm the cash in the escrow accounts. Do not let anyone tell you KPMG gave Wirecard a clean bill of health, it said, in careful accountant's language, we cannot confirm this business exists. Then came June 2020, and it happened in a week. On June 18, Wirecard's longtime auditor, EY, Ernst & Young, which had signed off on these accounts every year for about a decade, finally refused to sign. It said 1.9 billion euros was missing. The stock fell more than 60% in a single day. On June 19, Markus Braun resigned. And that same day, the company's chief operating officer, a charming, secretive Austrian named Jan Marsalek, got into a private jet and flew from a small airfield in Austria toward Minsk. He has not been seen in public since. On June 22, Wirecard admitted the truth, the 1.9 billion euros likely does not exist. Not misplaced. Never real. And on June 25, 2020, Wirecard filed for insolvency, the first company in the history of the DAX to go bankrupt. A member of Germany's blue-chip index, worth more than Deutsche Bank 18 months earlier, was worth nothing. The reason the missing money was never recovered is simple. You can't recover what was never there. The escrow accounts, the Asian partners, the profits, the auditors had blessed a business that, in KPMG's telling, may have been largely invented. So who answered for it? Markus Braun was arrested days after the collapse and has been in detention since. His criminal trial opened in Munich in December 2022, and, remarkably, it is still going. Braun denies everything. His defense is that he was a victim too, that the real mastermind was Marsalek, who looted the company and ran. As of now there is no verdict, a court has separately held him liable in a civil case, but the criminal case remains open and he is entitled to the presumption of innocence. We're not going to tell you how it ends, because it hasn't. Jan Marsalek is a different kind of story. He is a fugitive, on Interpol's most wanted list, and, according to extensive reporting by journalists and intelligence agencies, living in Russia under a false identity, under the protection of Russian intelligence. In March 2025, a court in London convicted a ring of Bulgarian spies of working for Russia, and prosecutors said that Cell took its instructions from Marsalek. He himself has never stood trial. Everything about his second life is reported, alleged, investigated, not yet proven in a courtroom. But the man who ran the operations of a German tech champion may also have been running errands for a foreign spy service. That is where this story goes, and nobody saw it coming. The one person who has actually admitted to the fraud is a third man, Oliver Bellenhaus, who ran a Wirecard subsidiary in Dubai, turned himself in, and became the prosecution's key witness. His account and Braun's flatly contradict each other, which is part of why the trial has dragged on for years. And the institutions? They did, eventually, pay something. Germany's audit watchdog banned EY from taking on new listed clients for 2 years and fined it, the firm that had signed the accounts for a decade. The head of BaFin, the regulator that chased the journalists, was pushed out, and the agency was reorganized. A parliamentary inquiry hauled ministers and officials in to explain how the entire German state apparatus missed, or shielded, a fraud this size. But for ordinary shareholders there was almost nothing to recover. In late 2025, Germany's highest court ruled that their damage claims ranked behind everyone else's in the insolvency. The people who believed the success story were, quite literally, last in line. Here's what Wirecard should teach you, and it isn't watch out for clever criminals. The fraud was not clever. The entire trick was to put the money somewhere no one could easily look, offshore escrow, foreign partners, a trustee in between, and then treat any doubt as an insult. That's it. The genius wasn't in the deception. It was in the deference the deception bought. Because look at what had to fail. An auditor signed these accounts for roughly 10 years and, by the FT's reporting, went more than 3 years without once asking the banks directly whether the €1 billion was actually there, the single phone call that would have ended it. A national regulator was handed the evidence and chose to shield the company and pursue the reporters. Politicians held Wirecard up as a point of pride. Every layer of protection that's supposed to make a market trustworthy became a layer of protection for the fraud. So the real signal was never a clever forgery you'd need to be an expert to catch. It was structural, and it was visible the whole time. The profit lived somewhere you couldn't verify, and the company reacted to questions with lawyers instead of bank statements. When the money is always just out of view, offshore, in a partner you can't audit, in an account only they can confirm, the absence isn't a detail to be explained. The absence is the story. The journalists understood that years early. It just took the collapse of a €24 billion company for everyone whose job it was to listen. If you want the American version, a company the accountants also blessed all the way to zero, watch our film on Enron. The pattern rhymes.